The moment I read those words in Joseph Smith's own handwriting, everything I thought I knew about my life collapsed like a temple built on sand. 11 minutes. That's all it took. 35 years of faith, thousands of hours in church service, 4 children raised in the covenant, a marriage built on shared belief, and 11 minutes of reading the founding prophet's own account destroyed everything I thought I knew about God, about truth, about myself. My name is Marcus David Harding, and this is the story of how I lost my testimony, my standing, nearly my marriage, and somehow found something I never knew I was missing. I need to take you back to a Sunday evening in late September, the kind of evening that feels sacred in Utah County. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed designed by God himself to remind us we lived in the promised land. I was sitting in my home office in Provo, surrounded by the artifacts of a faithful life. On the wall hung my mission plaque from Sao Paulo, Brazil, faded now but still carrying the weight of 2 years that shaped everything I became. Next to it, my temple recommend, current and valid, a small card that represented worthiness in the eyes of God and the church. On my desk sat the standard works, scriptures so worn the gold lettering had faded from the spines, and a framed photo of my family taken at my youngest daughter's temple ceiling 3 years ago. We were all in white, smiling, eternal. At 57 years old, I had become the man everyone in my stake looked to when they had questions about doctrine or church history. I served on the High Council, taught early morning seminary for 15 years before that, and currently led an institute class for young adults at BYU. When members struggled with their testimonies, bishops sent them to me. I had answers. I had certainty. I had spent decades building an armor of knowledge that I believed made my faith invincible. That evening, Linda was in the kitchen preparing Sunday dinner. I could hear the familiar sounds of her moving between the stove and the counter, the clink of dishes, the soft hum of a hymn she probably didn't realize she was singing. We had been married for 34 years, sealed in the Salt Lake Temple on a spring morning that felt like stepping into eternity. She was the granddaughter of a stake president on one side and a temple matron on the other. Faith wasn't just something Linda practiced, it was the very blood in her veins. I was preparing a special lesson for the upcoming commemoration of the Restoration. My institute students were bright, faithful, but I knew they lived in a world of Google searches and Reddit forums. They had access to information that my generation never encountered until we were too old to care. I wanted to give them something powerful, something that would anchor their testimonies so deeply that no internet rabbit hole could shake them. I decided to go beyond the manual, beyond the correlation-approved materials, and straight to the primary sources. I would show them Joseph Smith's own words, unfiltered, and demonstrate that the prophet's account of the first vision was consistent, miraculous, and true. I logged onto the Joseph Smith Papers website, an official church resource, and began searching for the earliest accounts of the first vision. I had referenced these documents before in general terms, but I had never actually sat down and read them word by word. I was a teacher, not a historian, and I trusted that the scholars at BYU and church headquarters had done the careful work of verifying everything. My job was to present the faith-promoting conclusions, not to dig through the archives myself. The 1832 account came up first. I knew it existed. I had heard it mentioned in a church education system training once years ago. The instructor had briefly noted that Joseph wrote several accounts of his experience, each emphasizing different aspects depending on the audience. That made sense to me at the time. When I tell the story of meeting Linda, I emphasize different details depending on whether I'm talking to my children or my priesthood quorum. The human memory is selective, and spiritual experiences are hard to put into words. I expected to find the same sacred story told with minor variations in emphasis. I clicked on the document. The scan appeared on my screen, Joseph Smith's own handwriting, cramped and difficult to read. Below it, the transcription provided by church historians. I leaned forward in my chair and began to read. The first thing I noticed was the date. Joseph wrote this account in 1832, 12 years after the first vision supposedly occurred. This was the earliest known record, written in the prophet's own hand. I felt a small thrill of anticipation, imagining I was about to read the purest, least embellished version of the sacred event I had taught hundreds of times. Then I read the words. Joseph described being troubled about his sins as a young man. That was familiar. He wrote about searching the scriptures and finding that mankind had apostatized from the true faith. Also familiar. Then came the account of his prayer and the vision that followed. I read slowly, carefully, expecting to feel the Spirit confirm the truth I already knew. Instead, I felt my heart stop. Joseph wrote that he saw one being, not two, one personage, the Lord, Jesus Christ. There was no mention of God the Father appearing as a separate being. No mention of two glorious personages standing in the air above a young boy in a grove of trees. The entire doctrinal foundation of the Restoration, the knowledge that God and Jesus were separate physical beings, the truth that distinguished us from every other Christian church on earth, was completely absent from Joseph Smith's own first written account. I stared at the screen for a long moment, certain I had misread something. I went back to the beginning and read again, more carefully this time. The words did not change. Joseph described seeing the Lord, singular, who told him his sins were forgiven. The primary purpose of the visit, according to Joseph himself, was personal forgiveness, not a cosmic revelation about the nature of God or a commission to restore the true church. I felt the floor shift beneath my chair. For 35 years I had taught the first vision from the 1838 account, the one published in the Pearl of Great Price, the one every missionary memorizes and shares with investigators around the world. In that version, Joseph went to the grove confused about which church to join. Two personages appeared, the Father and the Son, and the Father pointed to Jesus and said, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him." Jesus then told Joseph that all churches were wrong, their creeds were an abomination, and Joseph should join none of them because the true church would be restored through him. It was the foundation of everything, the proof that God and Jesus were separate beings, the beginning of the Restoration, the reason 14 million people around the world paid tithing, attended 3-hour church blocks, sent their children on missions, and arranged their entire lives around temple covenants. But Joseph's own first written account told a different story. No two beings, no Father pointing to the Son, no commission to restore anything, just a young man troubled by his sins, praying for forgiveness, and receiving a vision of Jesus Christ who granted that forgiveness. I checked the timestamp on my computer later, trying to reconstruct exactly how long it took for my testimony to crumble. From the moment I opened the 1832 document to the moment I pushed back from my desk with tears streaming down my face, 11 minutes had passed. 11 minutes. I told myself there had to be an explanation. The church would not hide something this significant. Prophets and apostles had access to these documents. Surely they had reconciled the differences and could explain why Joseph's first account contradicted the version I had taught my entire adult life. I began searching for apologetic explanations and I found them. Memory is imperfect. Joseph emphasized different aspects for different audiences. The 1832 account was a rough draft, incomplete and personal, not meant for publication. But as I read these explanations, something inside me recognized them for what they were. Rationalizations. The same kind of mental gymnastics I had watched investigators perform when they did not want to accept the gospel. The same excuses I had gently dismantled in hundreds of teaching moments over the years. When someone twists themselves into knots trying to explain away evidence, that is not the Spirit testifying of truth. That is the desperate human mind trying to protect itself from pain. I kept searching, and that was my second mistake. Because the 1832 account was only the beginning. I discovered that Joseph Smith told the first vision story at least 4 different times, and the accounts varied wildly. In 1835, he described 2 personages but also mentioned many angels. In 1838, the familiar version appeared, with 2 personages clearly identified as the Father and the Son. In 1842, yet another variation emerged, Each telling added details, changed details, emphasized different purposes for the vision. The apologist said this was normal, that eyewitness accounts always vary, but these were not minor variations like misremembering the color of someone's shirt. These were fundamental contradictions about who appeared, why they appeared, and what they said. The very nature of God, the central distinctive doctrine of the Church, changed from version to version. I remembered every testimony meeting where I had stood and declared that Joseph Smith never wavered in his account, that the consistency of his story proved its truth. I remembered telling my institute students that critics attacked the prophet with lies and distortions, but the historical record vindicated him completely. I remembered bearing witness to investigators in my mission that they could trust Joseph because his story never changed. I had been repeating a lie for 35 years. Have you ever discovered something that made you question everything you were taught? Something that shattered a belief you held so deeply you did not even recognize it as a belief, but simply as the way things were? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. Because in that moment, sitting in my office surrounded by the artifacts of my faithful life, I realized I had been living in a carefully constructed world, and the walls were coming down. Linda called from the kitchen. Dinner was ready. Her voice was the same voice I had heard 10,000 times, warm and familiar, the voice of home. But I was no longer the man she had married. I was someone new, someone terrifying, someone who did not know how to walk into that dining room and pretend the world had not just ended. I closed the laptop. I wiped my face. I took 3 deep breaths and practiced the expression I would wear. Pleasant, tired maybe, but faithful, always faithful. I had spent my whole life learning how to look like a believing Latter-day Saint. Now I would discover how well I had learned. I walked to that dinner table carrying a weight my wife could not see, and I had no idea that in trying to protect her, I was about to start the loneliest chapter of my life. Linda had made pot roast, my favorite Sunday meal, the one she prepared when she wanted to show love without saying the words. The dining room smelled of garlic and rosemary, and the table was set with the good china we usually reserved for general conference weekends and family home evenings when the children visited. A single candle burned in the center of the table, casting soft shadows on the walls where framed temple prints hung like windows into eternity. She looked at me when I sat down, and I saw the question form in her eyes before she asked it. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," I said. The lie came so easily it frightened me. "The institute lesson is taking more research than I expected." She nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and bowed her head for the blessing. I followed automatically, the words of gratitude falling from my lips like coins into an empty well. "We thank thee for this food. We thank thee for the restored gospel. We thank thee for the prophet Joseph Smith." Each phrase felt different now, heavier, contaminated by the knowledge I carried. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk and silences. Linda mentioned that our daughter Rebecca had called, that the baby was starting to crawl, that they might visit for Thanksgiving. I responded with the appropriate sounds of interest and enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere, still sitting in front of that laptop, still reading Joseph Smith's handwriting, still watching my world collapse one sentence at a time. When Linda cleared the dishes, I excused myself to my office with the pretense of finalizing the lesson. She kissed my forehead as she passed, a gesture so routine we had stopped noticing it years ago. That night it felt like a brand, marking me as a deceiver. I waited until I heard her footsteps climb the stairs, until the bedroom door closed, and the house settled into nighttime quiet. Then I opened the laptop again. I did not sleep that night. I could not. The questions multiplied with every click, every search result, every document I discovered in the church's own archives. It was like pulling a thread on a sweater and watching the entire garment unravel. I had expected to find answers that would reassure me, explanations that would restore my faith. Instead, I found more contradictions, more suppressed documents, more evidence that the institution I had served my entire life had systematically hidden its own history from its members. I discovered the Gospel Topics essays, buried deep in the church's website, never mentioned in general conference, never discussed in Sunday school, never referenced in any manual I had used in 40 years of teaching. These essays, written by church historians and approved by the Correlation Committee, quietly admitted facts that would have been considered anti-Mormon lies when I was a missionary. Joseph Smith married other men's wives. He married teenagers, including a 14-year-old girl. The Book of Abraham translation did not match the Egyptian papyrus. The Book of Mormon contained anachronisms that scholars could not explain. And yes, there were multiple accounts of the first vision with significant differences. The information was there, technically available to anyone who searched hard enough. But it was hidden in plain sight, surrounded by faithful framing and apologetic language designed to soften the blow. The church had known these facts for decades, had actively suppressed them for most of my lifetime, and had only begun to acknowledge them in recent years as the internet made suppression impossible. I thought about every testimony meeting I had attended, every general conference talk I had absorbed, every lesson manual I had studied. Never once had any leader mentioned these issues honestly and directly. Instead, they spoke of doubt as a spiritual weakness, of questions as evidence of sin, of the importance of staying in the boat even when storms raged. They told us to put troublesome issues on the shelf, to trust that answers would come in God's time, to prioritize faith over evidence. But now I understood what that shelf really was. It was not a place to store questions until God provided answers. It was a burial ground for truth, a place where inconvenient facts went to die so the institution could maintain its power. The first hint of dawn was coloring the windows gray when I finally closed the laptop. My eyes burned from hours of reading. My back ached from sitting hunched in my chair, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the devastation inside. I felt hollowed out, like someone had reached into my chest and removed everything that gave my life meaning and structure. I stumbled to the couch in my office and lay down staring at the ceiling. The photo of my family at the temple ceiling hung directly in my line of sight. 4 children in white, Linda radiant beside me, all of us smiling with the certainty that we would be together forever, the sealing covenant, the promise of eternal families, the reason we paid tithing, attended meetings, obeyed commandments, and sacrificed time and money and sometimes relationships with people outside the faith. What if none of it was real? The question was so terrifying I could not hold it for more than a second before my mind recoiled. I had built my entire identity on the foundation of the restored gospel. I was a high counselor, a temple recommend-holding priesthood holder, a returned missionary, a gospel doctrine expert. Without those titles, without that framework, who was I? Just a middle-aged man in a suburb of Provo, with a career in insurance that had always felt like a distraction from my real purpose, which was serving the Lord. I must have slept because the next thing I knew, Linda was standing over me with concern creasing her forehead. "Marcus, you slept in your office? What is going on?" I sat up too quickly and the room spun. "I told you, the lesson. I got caught up in research." "For Institute?" She was not convinced. After 34 years of marriage, Linda could read me better than I could read myself. "You look like you have been crying." I touched my face and found it dry, but my eyes still felt swollen, and I knew the evidence of my nighttime breakdown must be visible. I needed to tell her something, needed to offer an explanation that would satisfy her without revealing the full scope of what I had discovered. "I found some historical documents," I said carefully. "Things I had never seen before, about Joseph Smith and the first vision." Linda's expression shifted. I watched the concern transform into something harder, more guarded. "What kind of documents?" "His own writings, his first account of what happened in the grove. It is different from what we teach." "Different how?" I hesitated. This was the moment. I could downplay my findings, reassure her that the differences were minor, suggest that I simply needed to study more to understand the context. I could protect her from the pain I was experiencing. I could protect our marriage, our family, our entire way of life. But something inside me rebelled against that choice. I had spent the night discovering how the church had hidden truth from its members, and here I was considering doing the same thing to my own wife. The hypocrisy was too bitter to swallow. In the earliest account, I said slowly, Joseph only mentions seeing one being, not the Father and the Son, just Jesus. And he says the purpose of the vision was to forgive his sins, not to tell him about the apostasy or the restoration of the church. Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head, a small, dismissive gesture I had seen her make 100 times when confronted with information she did not want to process. That is anti-Mormon propaganda. You know better than to read that garbage. It is from the church's own website, Linda, the Joseph Smith Papers. It is in his own handwriting. Then you are misreading it. You need to talk to someone who understands the context. Maybe Brother Jensen, he teaches church history at BYU. I have been reading the context all night. The church's own historians admit the accounts are different. They have essays about it buried on the website where no one will find them unless they search specifically. Linda's face had gone pale. She took a step back from me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before in our 34 years together. Fear. Not of the information I was sharing, but of me. Of what I was becoming. You need to stop, she said. Right now. You need to pray, to fast, to read the scriptures. You are being deceived. By the church's own documents? By Satan. He uses partial truths to destroy testimonies. You know this. You have taught this. Her voice was rising now, taking on the edge of panic. Marcus, think about what you are doing. Think about our family, the children, the grandchildren, everything we have built together. I am thinking about it. That is all I have been thinking about. Then stop researching and start praying. Go to the temple. Talk to the bishop. I wanted to tell her that prayer and temples and bishops were part of the system that had lied to me. I wanted to ask her how I could seek guidance from an institution I no longer trusted. But the terror in her eyes stopped me. She was not ready to hear what I had discovered. Maybe she would never be ready. You are right, I said, and the words tasted like ashes. I need to pray about this. I need to take it to the Lord. The relief that flooded her face broke something inside me. She wanted so badly to believe that this was a temporary trial, a test of faith that would ultimately strengthen my testimony. She needed to believe that because the alternative was unthinkable. If I lost my faith, what did that mean for our eternal marriage? For her own testimony? For everything she had built her life upon? If stories like this resonate with you, you are not alone. There are thousands of us navigating this same painful journey, watching relationships strain under the weight of religious transition. Subscribe to this channel because there are many more untold stories waiting to be shared, stories of people who found the courage to ask hard questions and survive the answers they discovered. The following weeks were the loneliest of my life. I continued my research in secret, late at night after Linda fell asleep in my car during lunch breaks in the library on Saturday mornings when I told her I was preparing lessons. Each new discovery added another brick to the wall growing between us. I learned about the Kinderhook plates, the fake artifacts that fooled Joseph Smith. I read about the failed prophecies, the promises that did not come true, the predictions about the second coming that passed unfulfilled. I studied the Book of Mormon itself with new eyes, noticing the 19th century Protestant theology, the King James Bible errors copied verbatim into a text supposedly translated from ancient golden plates. And I remembered everything I had done in defense of this faith. The investigators I had pressured to commit to baptism before they were ready. The young people I had counseled to marry within the covenant, even when they had doubts. The family members I had judged for falling away, assuming they had sinned or been offended or simply lacked the spiritual strength to endure. I had been so certain of my righteousness, so confident in my understanding of eternal truth. Now I saw myself clearly for the first time. not as a faithful servant of God, but as an enforcer of a system that prioritized obedience over honesty. One night, about 3 weeks after my initial discovery, I was sitting at my desk reading about the September 6, the scholars and feminists who had been excommunicated in 1993 for publishing historical research that contradicted official church narratives. I did not hear Linda come down the stairs. I did not know she was standing in the doorway until she spoke. "How long have you been doing this?" I turned and saw her face in the dim light of my desk lamp. She had been crying. Her garments showed beneath her robe, the sacred underwear we had both worn since our endowments, the constant physical reminder of covenants made in holy places. "Doing what?" "Do not lie to me, Marcus. I can see the screen. I know what websites you are visiting." She stepped into the room and her voice cracked on the next words. "I found your browser history. I know you have been reading anti-Mormon material for weeks. The Joseph Smith Papers is not anti-Mormon. The Gospel Topics essays are not anti-Mormon." I wanted to say these things, but the look on her face stopped me. She did not want explanations. She did not want evidence. She wanted her husband back, the man who had knelt across the altar from her in the Salt Lake Temple and promised to be faithful for eternity. "I have been trying to understand," I said quietly. "Understand what? How to destroy our family? Linda, please. Do you have any idea what this will do to the children, to our standing in the community? You are on the High Council, Marcus. People look up to you." "I know." "Then stop. Just stop." She was sobbing now, her body shaking with the force of her fear. "I do not care what those documents say. I do not care about history. I care about our eternal family. I care about seeing my parents again. I care about being with you forever." I stood and reached for her, but she flinched away from my touch. "You have changed," she whispered. "You look at me differently now. You look at everything differently. It is like living with a stranger." I could not deny it. I had changed. The world itself had changed, or rather, my understanding of it had shifted so fundamentally that nothing looked the same. The temple picture on the wall was no longer a window into eternity. It was a photograph of 5 people in rented white clothing, participating in a ritual based on Masonic ceremonies that Joseph Smith had adapted after his initiation into Freemasonry. The scriptures on my desk were not the Word of God translated by the gift and power of the Holy Ghost. They were the creative work of a 19th century treasure digger who had convinced himself, and millions of others, that his imagination was revelation. But I could not say any of this to Linda. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I love you," I said. "That has not changed." "Then prove it. Talk to President Gardner. Let him help you." President Gardner, my stake. President, a successful businessman, a former mission president, a man I had sustained as a prophet, seer, and revelator in his local jurisdiction. I had sat across from him in worthiness interviews, confessing small sins and receiving counsel. I had trusted him with my spiritual life. Now Linda was asking me to trust him with my doubt. "Okay," I said. "I will call him tomorrow." The relief returned to her face, but this time it was shadowed by something else. Suspicion, maybe. Or grief. She was already mourning the husband she feared she was losing, even as I stood right in front of her. She left without another word, and I listened to her footsteps climb the stairs. The bedroom door closed. I was alone again, surrounded by the evidence of my unraveling faith, facing a meeting that I knew would change everything. I walked into that stake president's office not knowing it would be the last time I entered that building as a believing member of the church. What I discovered there would force me to make a choice I never imagined facing, between the comfort of a lie and the loneliness of truth. President Gardner's office was exactly what you would expect from a successful Latter-day Saint businessman who had risen through the ranks of church leadership. Mahogany desk, polished to a mirror shine. Leather chairs that cost more than some families' monthly grocery budgets. On the walls hung the standard portraits, Joseph Smith with his noble gaze fixed on some distant horizon. Brigham Young looking stern and prophetic, and the current prophet smiling benevolently in his dark suit and red tie. A large photograph of the Salt Lake Temple dominated the space behind the desk, lit from within like a beacon calling the faithful home. I had been in this office many times before. Worthiness interviews before temple recommend renewals. High council coordination meetings. Disciplinary councils where I had sat in judgment of other members who had strayed from the path. I knew every detail of this room. The way the afternoon light fell through the Venetian blinds, the faint smell of leather and furniture polish, the soft hum of the air conditioning that kept the temperature exactly 72 degrees year-round. But that afternoon, walking through the door for my appointment with President Gardner, I felt like a stranger entering foreign territory. He stood to greet me with the firm handshake and warm smile I had seen him deploy 1,000 times. Richard Gardner was 63 years old, silver-haired and square-jawed, with the kind of confident presence that made people instinctively trust him. He had built a small construction company into a regional empire, served as mission president in Chile, and been stake president for the past 7 years. Everyone in our stake loved him. Everyone respected him. He was exactly the kind of man the church produced, successful, faithful, absolutely certain that the path he walked was the only path to happiness. "Brother Harding," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs, "please sit down. Sister Harding called yesterday and said you wanted to meet." She sounded concerned. Of course Linda had called ahead. Of course she had primed him for this conversation. I should have expected nothing less. In Mormon culture, wives were the first line of defense against apostasy. They reported concerns to bishops and stake presidents, organized family fasts for wayward husbands, and mobilized the Relief Society sisters to pray for struggling marriages. It was all done in the name of love, but sitting in that chair I recognized it for what it also was: surveillance, control. "I appreciate you making time for me," I said, falling into the formal patterns of speech that church settings demanded. "I know how busy you are." "Never too busy for a member of my high council." He settled into his own chair and steepled his fingers, the posture of a man preparing to listen and counsel. "Now what is troubling you? Linda mentioned something about church history." I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind 100 times over the past few days. I had imagined presenting the evidence systematically, walking President Gardner through the documents I had discovered, showing him the contradictions and the suppressed information, appealing to his intelligence and his integrity. Surely a man of his stature, a former mission president, someone who had dedicated his life to the gospel, would want to know the truth. Surely he would be as troubled as I was by the evidence of institutional deception. But looking at his face in that moment, I realized how naive those fantasies had been. "I found some documents," I began. "Primary sources from church archives. Joseph Smith's first written account of the first vision from 1832. President Gardner nodded slowly. "I am familiar with the various accounts." The words hit me like a physical blow. Familiar. He was familiar with them, which meant he had known, perhaps for years, perhaps for decades, about the contradictions I had only discovered weeks ago. He had known, and he had never said anything. He had stood in stake conference and borne testimony of Joseph Smith's consistent witness. He had taught and presided and counseled and judged, all while knowing that the official narrative was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. "You knew," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant. "You knew the accounts were different." "Brother Harding, the church has published essays addressing these historical matters. The information is available to anyone who seeks it. Buried on the website where no one will find it unless they already know to look. Never mentioned in general conference, never discussed in Sunday school or priesthood meeting. Never included in any manual I used in 40 years of teaching." President Gardner's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation, an assessment of how much damage control this conversation would require. "Faith is not about having all the answers," he said, his tone shifting into the measured cadence of a man delivering a memorized script. It is about trusting in the Lord's plan even when we do not understand everything. The restored gospel has blessed millions of lives. Families have been sealed for eternity. Missionaries have brought the light of Christ to every corner of the earth. These fruits testify of the truth more powerfully than any historical document. The fruits. I repeated the word like it tasted sour. What about the people who were taught lies? What about the investigators I baptized based on a version of the first vision that Joseph Smith himself did not write until years later? What about the members who paid tithing and served missions and sacrificed relationships with family outside the church, all because they believed they had the complete truth? They do have the truth, the essential truth, the saving ordinances, the priesthood authority, the path to exaltation, based on a foundation of historical deception. President Gardner leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something harder in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold pragmatism that reminded me he had not built a construction empire by being naive about how the world worked. Brother Harding, let me be direct with you. The church is not a history department. It is not an academic institution dedicated to publishing every document in its archives. It is the kingdom of God on earth, and its purpose is to bring souls unto Christ. Some information is faith-promoting, some information is not. The brethren have stewardship over what gets emphasized and what gets set aside. That is not deception. That is wise leadership. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. He was not denying the contradictions. He was not claiming the documents were anti-Mormon forgeries. He was simply arguing that hiding inconvenient truths was acceptable, even righteous, as long as the institution's goals were served. So the members do not deserve to know the full history of their own faith. The members deserve to have their testimonies strengthened, not undermined. Most people are not equipped to handle complexity. They need simple, clear narratives that help them stay on the covenant path. The historical details are for scholars and specialists, not for the average member sitting in sacrament meeting trying to keep their family together. Some truths are not useful for all members. The phrase surfaced in my mind unbidden, and I realized I was not surprised by President Gardner's position. I was not even particularly outraged. What I felt was something worse: recognition, because I had believed exactly the same thing for most of my adult life. I had taught simplified narratives because they were more effective. I had avoided difficult questions because they might weaken testimonies. I had prioritized faith over accuracy, conviction over evidence, loyalty over truth. President Gardner was not the villain in this story. He was a mirror. And looking at him, I saw myself as I had been just weeks ago, confident in my righteousness, certain that the ends justified the means, blind to the cost of the compromises I made every day. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. He relaxed slightly, perhaps sensing that the confrontational phase of our conversation was ending. "I want you to take some time away from your research. Put it aside for 60 days. During that time, focus on the fundamentals: scripture study, temple attendance, fasting, and prayer. Give the Lord a chance to speak to your heart instead of filling your mind with historical minutiae. And if after 60 days I still have doubts, then we will talk again. But I think you will find that the Spirit provides answers that documents cannot." He paused, and his voice took on a more personal tone. "Marcus, I have seen this before. Good men, faithful men, who stumble across information that shakes them. Most of them come back. They realize that their testimony is built on spiritual experiences, not historical evidence. They remember the times they felt the Spirit, the prayers that were answered, the blessings they received through obedience to the gospel. Those experiences are real. They cannot be explained away by academic arguments." I thought about my spiritual experiences, the warmth I felt during my mission when investigators accepted the gospel, the peace that settled over me in the temple, the moments of clarity during scripture study when passages seemed to speak directly to my situation. Those experiences had been real. I was not imagining them. But I had also read about the spiritual experiences of people in other faiths. Muslims who wept with certainty during Ramadan, Catholics who felt the presence of God during Mass, evangelicals who spoke in tongues and knew beyond doubt that Jesus had saved them personally. Even members of other restoration movements, Community of Christ, fundamentalist polygamous sects, each had their own powerful spiritual witnesses that their version of the gospel was true. If spiritual feelings were the ultimate arbiter of truth, then every religion was true. And if every religion was true, then the specific claims of Mormonism, the exclusive priesthood authority, the only true church on the face of the earth, became meaningless. I did not say any of this to President Gardner. There was no point. He had drawn his lines long ago, and no amount of evidence or argument would shift them. His testimony was not based on history or logic. It was based on identity. Being Mormon was who he was, the foundation of his family, his community, his business network, his entire social world. Questioning that identity would cost him everything, and he was simply not willing to pay that price. I understood completely. I had been the same way. Maybe I still was. "I will think about what you have said," I told him. "That is all I ask." He stood and extended his hand, signaling that our meeting was over. "Brother Harding, you have served faithfully for many years. You have blessed countless lives through your teaching and your example. Do not let a few troublesome documents undo all of that good. The adversary wants you to doubt. He wants you to question. He wants to destroy your eternal family. Do not give him that victory." I shook his hand and walked out of the office. The hallway stretched before me, lined with classroom doors and bulletin boards covered with announcements about youth activities and temple trips and missionary farewells. This was my world. These were my people. I had spent my entire adult life in buildings just like this one, speaking the same language, believing the same things, reinforcing the same patterns. Now I walked among them as a stranger, a spy in the house of the Lord. When I got home that evening, Linda was waiting in the living room. She stood when I entered, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mixture of hope and dread. "How did it go?" "He knew," I said. "About the documents, about the contradictions. He has known for years." Something flickered across her face. Surprise? Disappointment? Or perhaps recognition, the same recognition I had felt sitting across from President Gardner. "And?" "He told me to set aside my research for 60 days. To focus on the fundamentals, to trust the Spirit instead of the documents. That sounds like wise counsel. Does it?" I heard the edge in my own voice and could not soften it. He admitted that the church hides information from members. He said some truths are not useful for everyone. He practically told me that lying is acceptable as long as it serves the institution. He did not say that. He did. Those were almost his exact words. And the worst part is I cannot even be angry with him because I believe the same thing. For 35 years I taught a version of history that I never bothered to verify. I pressured people to join a church without telling them the whole story. I am just as guilty as he is. Linda's face crumpled. She sank onto the couch and covered her eyes with her hands, and I watched her shoulders shake with silent sobs. I should have gone to her. I should have held her and comforted her and promised that everything would be all right. But I could not move. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching my wife grieve for the man I used to be. "I cannot do this," she whispered through her tears. "I cannot live with someone who is losing their faith. My parents were married in the temple. My grandparents were pioneers who crossed the plains. This church is everything to me, Marcus. Everything." "I know." "Do you? Do you understand what you are asking me to give up?" "I am not asking you to give up anything. I am just trying to be honest about what I have discovered." She looked up at me, and her eyes were red and swollen and filled with a pain I had never seen before. "Honest? You want to be honest? What about your covenants? What about your promises to God and to me? You stood across the altar and promised to be faithful. Was that a lie?" "No. I meant every word. I still mean every word. I love you, Linda. That has not changed. But you do not believe anymore. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I wanted to deny them. I wanted to tell her that I still believed in God, in Jesus, in the importance of family and service and trying to be a good person. But I knew that was not what she meant. She meant the church, the institution, the specific claims of Mormonism that separated us from the rest of Christianity. Did I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet? Did I believe the Book of Mormon was an ancient record? Did I believe the temple ordinances were essential for exaltation? A month ago, I would have answered yes to all of those questions without hesitation. Now I could not answer them at all. I do not know what I believe anymore, I admitted. I am trying to figure it out. Linda stood slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and controlled, the voice of a woman who had made a decision. I've been thinking about this all week, about what to do if you cannot find your way back. And I have decided that I cannot sit by and watch you destroy yourself and our family. She walked to the closet and pulled out 2 suitcases I had not noticed sitting there. I packed your things. I think you should stay somewhere else for a while. Linda, please do not argue with me. I have prayed about this. I have fasted. I feel at peace with this decision. At peace. She was kicking me out of my own home and she felt at peace. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. But then I looked at her face, really looked, and I saw the truth behind the controlled exterior. She was not at peace. She was terrified. She was doing the only thing she knew how to do, the thing she had been taught her whole life. When someone threatens your testimony, you create distance. You protect yourself and your family from the contagion of doubt. I had taught that lesson myself years ago to a young woman whose boyfriend was questioning the church. I told her to break up with him, to guard her heart, to prioritize her eternal salvation over her temporary feelings. She had listened to me. She had ended the relationship. And I had felt righteous about giving her that counsel. Now I was the contagion. And my own wife was taking the advice I had once given others. Where should I go? I asked. There is a hotel near the freeway, or maybe one of your brothers would take you in. She paused, and for a moment the mask slipped, and I saw the woman I had loved for 34 years, frightened and heartbroken and desperately trying to save what she could from the wreckage. I am not saying this is permanent. I'm saying I need time. We both need time. Maybe the 60 days that President Gardner suggested. You do your spiritual work, I will do mine. And we will see where we are at the end. I wanted to fight. I wanted to refuse to leave, to insist on my rights, to demand that she hear me out and try to understand what I was going through. But I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, and I knew that pushing her would only make things worse. She needed space. Maybe I did too. I picked up the suitcases, heavier than I expected, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, Linda's voice stopped me. Marcus. I turned. I still love you. I need you to know that. Whatever happens, I have never stopped loving you. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw tears streaming down her face again. I wanted to go to her, to hold her, to promise that we would find a way through this together. But the suitcases in my hands and the distance between us felt like an ocean, vast and cold and impossible to cross. I love you too, I said. And then I walked out into the evening air, alone for the first time in 34 years of marriage, carrying everything I owned in 2 pieces of luggage and wondering if I would ever find my way home again. The hotel room was beige and anonymous, exactly the kind of place where people go when their lives have fallen apart. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, too numb to cry, too exhausted to think. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Just checking you arrived safely. I typed back a brief confirmation and set the phone face down on the nightstand. I had nowhere to be, no one expecting me. For the first time in decades, the structure that had organized my entire life was gone. No church meetings to prepare for, no lessons to teach, no worthiness interviews to conduct, just empty hours stretching ahead, filled with questions I did not know how to answer. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and a thought came to me unbidden, rising from some deep place I had not known existed. What if this is not the end? What if this is the beginning of something I cannot yet see? The thought frightened me almost as much as everything else, because it suggested that there might be life beyond the church, beyond the identity I had constructed, beyond the certainties that had carried me for 35 years. And I was not sure I was brave enough to find out what that life might look like. But I had no choice. The old life was gone. The only direction left was forward, into the unknown. I closed my eyes and waited for morning. The first week in that hotel room was the darkest of my life. I barely ate. I slept in fragments, waking at 3 or 4 in the morning with my heart pounding, reaching for Linda across a bed that was empty. The silence was the worst part. After 34 years of marriage, I had forgotten what silence sounded like. Linda humming hymns while she cooked, the television playing general conference talks in the background, the phone ringing with calls from ward members needing counsel or comfort. All of that was gone now, replaced by the hum of the air conditioner and the muffled sounds of strangers walking past my door. I called my children one by one. That was a mistake I was not prepared for. Rebecca, my oldest, wept on the phone and told me she would pray for my soul. She said she could not let me see the grandchildren until I resolved my faith crisis, that she needed to protect them from confusion. Her words were gentle but final, delivered with the same calm certainty I had taught her to cultivate since childhood. I heard my own voice in hers, my own lessons about protecting families from those who had fallen away, and the irony cut so deep I could barely breathe. David, my second child, was angry. He had served a mission in Argentina, had sacrificed 2 years of his life teaching the same lessons I now questioned. When I tried to explain what I had discovered, he interrupted me with a voice tight with fury. "Do you know what you're doing to Mom? Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family? I don't want to hear your anti-Mormon garbage, Dad. Call me when you've come to your senses." The line went dead before I could respond. Emily, my third, was the most painful. She listened quietly as I explained the documents, the contradictions, the suppressed history. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I know, Dad. I've known for years. I just never thought I could tell anyone." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "You knew? I found the same things when I was at BYU." My roommate showed me the CES letter, and I spent a whole semester researching everything. I almost left the church then. But I looked at my life, at my family, at everything I would lose, and I decided it wasn't worth it. So I stayed. I go through the motions. I say the right things, but I haven't believed in years. My daughter, my faithful temple-married daughter who taught Relief Society and brought her children to every ward activity. She had been living a double life, wearing a mask I never suspected, carrying a secret that must have been crushing her for years. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "How could I? You were the gospel doctrine expert. You were the one everyone came to with their doubts. I was afraid you would be disappointed in me, or worse, that you would try to fix me, that you would give me the same counsel you gave everyone else about putting things on the shelf and trusting the Spirit." She paused, and I heard the catch in her voice. "I've been so alone, Dad, for so long." We talked for 3 hours that night. She told me about the isolation of being a closeted non-believer in a community where faith was the currency of belonging. She described the exhaustion of performing belief week after week, smiling through testimonies she did not share, teaching lessons she did not believe, answering her children's questions with doctrine she knew was built on unstable foundations. She had considered leaving her husband, who was a true believer like Linda, but she could not bear the thought of losing her children in a custody battle that would inevitably favor the faithful parent. When we finally hung up, I sat in the darkness of that hotel room and wept, not just for myself but for her, for all the years she had suffered in silence while I stood at the pulpit and reinforced the very system that trapped her. I had been so proud of my ability to strengthen testimonies, never realizing that some of the people I thought I was helping were drowning right in front of me. My youngest child, Michael, was the last call I made. He lived in Seattle now, had moved there after graduating from the University of Utah with a degree in computer science. He had been less active for years, attending church sporadically, always finding excuses to miss family gatherings that centered on religious events. Linda and I had prayed for him constantly, had put his name on the temple prayer roll, had fasted for his return to the fold. We assumed he was struggling with temptation, that the secular world had pulled him away from the truth. When I told him what I had discovered, he laughed, not cruelly but with a kind of weary relief. "Welcome to the club, Dad. I figured this out when I was 17. I just didn't have the guts to say anything." 17? I found some stuff online. Asked my seminary teacher about it. He told me I was reading Satan's lies and that I needed to repent for even looking at that material. So I shut up and counted the days until I could leave for college. I served a mission because I knew it would destroy Mom if I didn't, and I spent 2 years in Guatemala teaching things I didn't believe to people who deserved better. When I got home, I promised myself I would never live that lie again. I thought about the distance that had grown between Michael and the rest of the family over the years. The awkward silences at family dinners. The way he always had somewhere else to be when we invited him to temple sessions or baptisms. I had attributed it to worldliness, to the natural rebellion of youth, to the pull of a society that celebrated sin and mocked faith. I never considered that he might simply know things I did not, that his distance was not rebellion, but self-preservation. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry for all the times I judged you, all the times I pressured you to come back to church, all the counsel I gave that must have felt like salt in a wound. You didn't know, Dad. You were doing what you thought was right. That's what makes this whole thing so tragic. Everyone in the church is doing what they think is right, and they're all hurting each other without even realizing it." After that call, I did not sleep at all. I lay awake watching the ceiling lighten with the approaching dawn, thinking about my family, scattered now across a landscape of belief and doubt, connected by blood and history, but divided by truths we had been afraid to share. 4 children raised in the covenant, 1 still believing and furious, 1 maintaining appearances while dying inside, 2 who had escaped but carried scars they would never fully heal. And Linda, my eternal companion, alone in our house in Provo, probably kneeling by the bed at this very moment, praying for my lost soul. If this story has moved you and you would like to support more content like this, there is a link in the description and pinned comment where you can buy me a coffee. Every contribution helps keep these stories alive and gives voice to those still afraid to speak. Because for every person brave enough to share their journey, there are thousands more suffering in silence waiting for permission to be honest. The 60 days President Gardner had prescribed passed slowly. I did not follow his counsel, not exactly. I did not return to the temple or immerse myself in scripture study or fast for the restoration of my testimony. But I did think. I thought more deeply and honestly than I had allowed myself to think in 35 years of faithful obedience. I read books by people who had left the church and rebuilt their lives. I listened to podcasts where former members shared their stories, and I heard echoes of my own experience in everyone. I started seeing a therapist, a non-member who specialized in religious transition, and for the first time in my life I talked about my doubts without fear of judgment or correction. Slowly, painfully, I began to construct a new understanding of who I was and what I believed. I still believed in God, or at least in something larger than myself, some force or presence that gave meaning to the universe. But I no longer believed that any institution had exclusive access to that presence. The spiritual experiences I had treasured were real, but they were not unique to Mormonism. They were human experiences, available to anyone who sought connection with the divine, regardless of the labels they used or the rituals they performed. I still believed in family, in the importance of love and commitment and sacrifice for those we hold dear. But I no longer believed that those bonds required institutional validation. My love for Linda was not created by the temple ceiling. It was created by 34 years of shared laughter and struggle, of raising children together, of holding each other through grief and celebrating together in joy. If that love was real, it did not need a certificate signed by a man in a white suit to make it eternal. I still believed in community, in the value of gathering with others who shared your values and supported your growth. But I no longer believed that community required uniformity of belief. The ward I had served for decades was not the only place where people could find belonging. There were other communities, other gatherings, other ways of being together that did not demand the surrender of intellectual honesty. When the 60 days ended, I called Linda and asked if we could meet. She agreed, her voice cautious and tired, and we arranged to have dinner at a restaurant we had frequented in the early years of our marriage, before the children came, when we were still discovering each other. She looked older than I remembered. The weeks apart had taken a toll on her, too. Her hair was grayer, her face more lined, her movements slower and more deliberate. But her eyes were the same eyes I had fallen in love with in a BYU student ward 40 years ago, blue and deep and searching. We talked for hours. I told her everything I had learned, not just about church history, but about myself. I told her about the calls with our children, about Emily's secret and Michael's years of silent suffering. I told her about the therapy, about the books, about the slow process of rebuilding an identity that did not depend on institutional approval. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she barely touched. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I've been doing some reading, too." I stared at her. "You have?" "After you left, I was so angry. I wanted to prove you wrong, to find the answers that would bring you back. So I started looking at the sources you mentioned, the Joseph Smith papers, the Gospel Topics essays." She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I found the same things you found, and I don't know what to think anymore." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back with the determination of a woman who had spent a lifetime controlling her emotions. "I'm not where you are. I still want to believe, but I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't pretend the contradictions don't exist." I reached across the table and took her hand. She did not pull away. "I'm not asking you to leave the church," I said. "I'm not asking you to believe what I believe or doubt what I doubt. I'm just asking if we can figure this out together, if we can be honest with each other, even when it's hard, if we can love each other without requiring agreement on everything." She looked at our joined hands for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and I saw something in her face I had not seen in months. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but present. "I don't know if I can do that," she said. "I was raised to believe that marriage requires shared testimony, that a house divided cannot stand." "We've been divided for months," I replied. "And we're still here, still talking, still trying. Maybe that's what love actually looks like. Not agreement, but commitment. Not uniformity, but the willingness to stay even when staying is hard." She did not answer right away. Instead, she squeezed my hand, and we sat together in the fading light of the restaurant, two people who had built a life on foundations that had crumbled, trying to find new ground to stand on. I would like to tell you that everything was resolved that night, that Linda and I went home together and rebuilt our marriage and lived happily ever after. But that would be a lie, and I have told enough lies to last a lifetime. The truth is messier. The truth is that Linda still attends church every Sunday, still wears her garments, still believes in the core claims of the Restoration, even as she struggles with the historical details. And I do not attend anymore. I have not been inside a church building since that meeting with President Gardner. My name is still on the records technically, but I have begun the process of resignation, A slow and bureaucratic procedure that feels like the final severing of a limb I did not know was gangrenous. We live in the same house now. I moved back after that dinner, and we have been working with a therapist, a couples counselor who specializes in mixed-faith marriages. It is hard. There are days when the distance between us feels insurmountable, when her faith and my doubt collide in ways that leave us both wounded. But there are other days, more of them lately, when we find each other across that distance and remember why we fell in love in the first place. Rebecca still will not let me see the grandchildren without supervision. She is afraid I will poison their testimonies, that I will plant seeds of doubt in their young minds. I have accepted this boundary for now because pushing against it would only make things worse. But I grieve for those children, for the relationship we might have had, for the grandfather I wanted to be. David has not spoken to me since that first phone call. His wife sends occasional updates through Linda, polite and distant, the kind of communication you maintain with a relative who has become a stranger. I pray for him, in my own way, to whatever force might be listening. Not that he will come to see things my way, but that he will find peace with whatever path he chooses. Emily and I talk every week now. She has started attending a support group for people in mixed-faith Mormon marriages, and she is slowly finding the courage to be more honest with her husband. I do not know if their marriage will survive that honesty, but I know that the alternative, a lifetime of performance and pretense, was killing her. Whatever happens, she will not face it alone. Michael flew home for Thanksgiving this year, the first time he has joined a family gathering in 5 years. We spent an afternoon hiking in the mountains above Provo, just the two of us, talking about everything and nothing. He told me he was proud of me, proud that I had found the courage to ask questions even when the answers cost me everything. I told him I was sorry it took me so long, sorry that he had to carry his own doubts alone for so many years. We did not resolve anything, did not heal all the wounds of the past, but we took a step toward each other, and that felt like enough. I'd love to know what moment in this story hit you the hardest, or if you have lived something similar, what gave you the courage to keep going? Share in the comments below. You might help someone else feel less alone. I am 58 years old now. More than half my life was spent in service to an institution I no longer believe in. Some days that feels like a tragic waste. All those hours in meetings and callings, all that tithing money, all that energy devoted to building someone else's kingdom. I could have spent that time on other things. I could have been a different person, but most days I see it differently. Those years were not wasted. They were the necessary path that brought me here, to this moment, to this fragile new beginning. I learned things in the church that I still value. Lessons about service and sacrifice and the importance of community. I built relationships that sustain me even now, friendships that have survived my transition, connections that transcend institutional boundaries. And I raised 4 children who, despite everything, are good people trying to navigate a complicated world. The restoration I believe in now is not Joseph Smith's restoration. It is my own. The rebuilding of a life from broken pieces. The recovery of a self that was buried under decades of performance and pretense, the slow, painful process of becoming authentic after a lifetime of wearing masks. I used to believe that faith meant certainty, that doubt was weakness, that questions were dangerous. Now I understand that faith is what remains when certainty is stripped away. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is the refusal to ask questions, the insistence on answers that foreclose inquiry. The elevation of comfort over truth. For 35 years, I was religiously faithful and spiritually asleep. The documents I found, Joseph Smith's own handwriting, did not destroy my faith. They woke me up. And waking up, however painful, is always better than the alternative. I keep a copy of the 1832 account on my desk now. Not as a trophy or a weapon, but as a reminder. In that document, a young man wrestled with his sins and his questions and his desperate need for forgiveness. He saw something in that grove, experienced something that changed him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it. The stories he told evolved and changed because he was human, because memory is imperfect, because spiritual experiences resist easy translation into words. I do not know if what Joseph saw was real. I do not know if God and Jesus appeared to him, or if he experienced something internal, psychological, no less powerful for being human rather than divine. What I know is that his struggle was genuine, and in that struggle, I recognize my own. 11 minutes to break. A lifetime to rebuild. Some days the rebuilding feels impossible. Some days the grief is so heavy I can barely move. But then I look at Linda across the breakfast table, or I hear Emily's voice on the phone, or I watch Michael laugh at something on television, and I remember that love does not require agreement, that family does not require uniformity, that the most sacred bonds are the ones that survive the fire. I do not know what happens after we die. I no longer believe in the celestial kingdom as the church describes it, the eternal family unit sealed by priesthood authority, the degrees of glory earned through obedience to specific ordinances. But I believe that whatever is true about the universe, it is larger and stranger and more beautiful than any institution can capture. And I believe that the connections we forge in this life, the loves we nurture, the truths we seek, matter in ways that transcend doctrine and dogma. The temple picture still hangs on our wall. Linda is not ready to take it down, and I have not asked her to. When I look at it now, I do not see a window into eternity. I see 5 people in white clothing, standing together on a spring morning, full of hope and certainty. I see my children before they knew how complicated the world would become. I see Linda and myself before the questions came, before the documents, before the long, dark nights of doubt. I see who we were. And I honor those people even as I become someone new. That is the only kind of resurrection I believe in anymore. Not the rising of bodies from graves, but the rising of selves from the rubble of collapsed certainties. The courage to look at what is broken and choose to build again. The faith, real faith, that something new can grow in the ashes of what was lost. 11 minutes destroyed 35 years of belief. But 11 minutes also gave me something I never had before. The freedom to be honest, the permission to doubt, the chance to discover who I might become when I stopped performing and started living. And somehow, against all odds, that feels like the most sacred gift I have ever received.